collapse, Interregnum, Renaissance. These are three emergency civilizational realities that the Urantia Book presents to us regarding the future our present civilization faces. Here, in this growing gulf, right here between where we are and where we need to get to, if we want to continue with an uninterrupted evolution of civilization here on this planet, and at this time in our history of the ascent of humanity, as our global civilization, shaken to its core, rattles under the pressures of change, disruptions, and complexification. As we saw in Section 2 of Civilization in Crisis, evolutionary progress works in a vertical dimension, while adaptation works across the horizontal plane. The gulf here, right here, is called an interregnum. We are told that this is a destiny decision point in our ascension to a higher civilization, or it is a paralysis point that causes a regression backward and a spiral down into collapse. This here is the choice point to either adapt to the problematic life conditions of our times and move up the vertical spiral to a new renaissance, or to pause in an interregnum and then regress or regression back down the spiral into the madness of history. The Urantia Book tells us that our civilization is in emergency situation. In paper 99, it tells us that we must find inspiration and provide leadership in this impending worldwide social reconstruction and economic reorganization of the social order and the economic system, which is destined to undergo reconstruction. We must function helpfully and creatively in the present crisis of civilization. In this one paragraph, it uses the word reconstruction, reorganization, reconstruct in the presence of the crisis of civilization. Paper 99 goes on. During the psychologically unsettled times, amid the economic upheavals, the moral crosscurrents, and the sociological riptides of the cyclonic transitions of a scientific era, thousands upon thousands of men and women have become humanly dislocated. They are anxious, restless, fearful, uncertain, and unsettled. As never before in the world's history, they need the consolation and stabilization of a sound cosmic perspective. In the face of unprecedented scientific achievement and mechanical development, there is spiritual stagnation and philosophic chaos. We can sense it, we can feel it, it's everywhere. This presentation of our investigation is Section 3A and is a continuation from Section 2 of our investigation of how the push of complexification in the progressive development of evolution in both the individual, you and I, and civilization is causing an emergence of something new. Something new from something old. Something higher from something lower. Something more from something less. This is the new vision, a new worldview for a new emergence that is needed right now as our planet, our society, our civilization staggers under this tsunami of global pressures that threaten to swamp our fragile ship of humanity. The Urantia Book tells us that the social ship of humanity has steamed out of the sheltered bays of established tradition and has begun its cruise upon the high seas of evolutionary destiny. And the soul of humanity, as never before in the world's history, needs carefully to scrutinize its charts of morality and painstakingly to observe the compass of spiritual guidance. This in-between time, this pause in our civilizational development, is called an interregnum. And it is probably the only window of opportunity that we have left, or that we are going to have, to get a handle on this crisis. In paper 99 again, the Urantia Book tells us this: mechanical inventions and the dissemination of knowledge are modifying civilization. That's an understatement. Certain economic adjustments and social changes are imperative if cultural disaster is to be avoided. This new oncoming social order will not settle down complacently for a millennium. The human race must become reconciled to a process of changes, adjustments, and readjustments. Humankind is on the march towards a new and unrevealed planetary destiny. Again, we feel that, we intuitively feel that in our bones. And communications have changed everything. Communications change things because they develop the imagination and they expand desire. It's not so much that the new technologies, the hard technologies of the mobile phones, the internet, the social networks, it's not so much that they have caused the most recent processes from the Arab Spring onwards, as much as it is the soft technologies or the liquid technologies of information, knowledge, and comparison with other realities that's changing everything. It is knowledge that makes us conscious of our differences with respect to others and produces desire and action. The hard technologies only provide the necessary instruments. It's the imagination that triggers the soft, liquid ideas and ideals that help us to see that the old ideologies that once served as a rock-solid foundation on which to build our civilizational home has turned to quicksand. And there is no new rocks on which to build a new foundation for the new civilization. And it is this that is helping us to see that the planetary crisis has a direct and social significant consequence to both democracy and representative governance. A tangible sign that the system is no longer able to take the strain, and new social balances are needed to reform the present worldview, the present foundation on which we stand. This is fueled by a widespread diffusion of new technologies that no state, even ones determined to maintain the integrity of their borders, can prevent. But force, violence, revolution, etc., is not necessary or even appropriate, because no power can halt the imagination when it is fueled by knowledge and communication. We saw this in the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the printing press. And today we see this with the internet and the new Renaissance, the new worldview that we are birthing right now. A special feature of this crisis is its duration. In the past, these crises were called unfavorable conjunctures. Right. And usually these could be resolved over a short period of time. But that has come to an end. Now, planetary crises, which are so complex and so multifaceted because they involve so much of the planet, take eons to turn around. It's the difference between turning around a kayak and turning around a cruise ship 180 degrees. These crises creep in very slowly, in contrast to the speed with which other human activities in our contemporary world actually move. It's hard to understand what's happening. Any breaking news as to the state of the crisis are scheduled, then rescheduled, and then rescheduled, and continuously kicked down the road, and then postponed until some later date. It never seems to end. When one crisis seems to end, another seems to step right into its place. Perhaps it's just the same huge crisis that feeds in on itself, changes over time, transforming and regenerating itself continually. In the meantime, the crisis devours and changes the lives of millions. And we see that every day, all across the world right now. Refugee problems, this diaspora of people leaving the war zones, these failed states, failed governments, and the brutality is making this the rule of life rather than the exception, becoming an everyday event and an everyday habit which we have to deal with, rather than an occasional annoying inconvenience that needs to get rid of as quickly as possible. Living in a constant state of crisis is not easy. But we must learn to live with crisis, learn to understand it, and learn how to mitigate its effects, just as we do with much of the endemic adversity imposed upon us by just the evolution of our times. Crowds, pollution, noise, corruption, but above all, fear. The oldest feeling in the world that accompanies us through a reality marked by insecurity. We will have to get used to living with crisis, because crisis is here to stay. But we do not have to live in fear. Not if we understand what the crisis is, how it got here, and most importantly, what the exit strategy is, and how to implement that. That is the job of the investigator and the futurist, to provide flexible instruments for the proper interpretation of the trends, forecasts, and the trajectory of the situation. As the Buddhists might say, we need to see things rightly. What we need is an effective diagnosis of the symptoms of our time, just as you would if you were sick and went to a doctor with a set of symptoms. In paper 118 of the Urantia Book, section 8, we can read this. When culture advances too fast, when material achievement outruns the evolution of wisdom, then does civilization contain within itself the seeds of retrogression. And unless buttressed by the swift augmentation of experiential wisdom, such human societies will recede from high but premature levels of attainment, and the dark ages of the interregnum of wisdom will bear witness to the inexorable restoration of the imbalance between self-liberty and self-control. Everything we have built is in danger. Freedom, democracy, sovereignty, the dark ages of the interregnum of wisdom are already upon us. We seem lost in a sea of complexification, and our ship of humanity is at risk. We see retrogression, the evolutionary chart in reverse, taking place in so many places on our planet right now, and more coming on stream even as we speak. We can see this crisis right on our own borders, right in our own borders, and in the borders of every nation state. Disorder is felt in every part of the world, in every country, and above all, at the same time. This makes it all pervasive and a tremendous impact on our lives and on our consciences. Because for the first time, we discover that there is no safe haven to take refuge in. We can begin to see it everywhere, but particularly right now in the European crisis, the refugee crisis in Europe. There is no alternative to a global system that appears to be collapsing. Wherever we look, we can see signs of melee, dysfunction, problems, and crisis which appear to us to be a world in ruin, while actually it is a world undergoing a change, a transition from an old system that no longer works to a new, but as yet not defined system that is still on the drawing boards, and we are the architects of it. This time is an absolute important moment in history. But our inability to embrace the interregnum, the delicate transition phase between the old that is breaking up and the new that is breaking through and not yet on the horizon, urges many to have one of three reactions, and though understandable, does not produce results. The first is nostalgia. We all do it, looking at the past as the model of order with a feeling of yearning and regret. If we could only get back to the old way of doing things. If we could only make our country great again. This is just sloganeering, and it will not help. We are on the move forward. The second reaction often is just waiting, the do nothing. Just wait, believing that the crisis is only temporary, and hoping that by paying a high cost now and a bit of pain, we will eventually return to some former state. We're moving forward. We're moving onward, and we need to adapt to these new problematic life situations. Number three is probably the worst of them all. Selfishness. The trying to survive this disorder at an individual level, forgetting the shared values and the fundamental principles that built this society, this country, this world, and that all human relations are based on. What kind of a world do we want for our children, our grandchildren, our brothers and sisters? That is why we are investigating this collection of 196 papers called the Urantia Book, where we see a constellation of ideas and ideals rise up to clarify the situation and show us the solutions to these problems, one star at a time, one idea at a time, one ideal at a time. Specifically in this chapter, we are studying papers 68 to 72 and paper 81, The Development of Modern Civilization. And for those who wish to dig a bit deeper, you can find other organizations offering classes and courses on our website, the Urantia Book for Dummies. Because this is the Urantia Book for Dummies, Chapter 2, Civilization in Crisis, Section 3A, The Solutions. So let's begin with scenario number 1 here, the Interregnum. A man called Antonio Gramsci gave one of the best explanations of what an interregnum is when, in a long incarceration in an Italian prison during the Depression of the 1930s, he wrote this in one of his notebooks. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. A great variety of morbid symptoms are appearing here. The longest interregnum on the planet that we're aware of happened right after the collapse of the Roman Empire, what today we call the medieval Dark Ages. The term interregnum was originally used to denote the time lag between the death of a king or a pope and the enthronement of the successor. This in-between period was a very dangerous time in which the kingdom experienced a rupture in the otherwise continuity of government, law, social order. It was a very vulnerable time for the kingdom at that point. Roman law put an official stamp on such an understanding of the term when it accompanied an interregnum with the proclamation of Justinian, a period during which activity in the law courts was formally suspended, a kind of a legal vacation, a temporary suspension of the laws when often martial law was imposed, presumably in anticipation of new and different laws being proclaimed by the new ruler, but often because of the absolute confusion that was running through the people at the time. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, we did see, in fact, an interregnum of nearly 1,000 years, with a great variety of morbid symptoms that appeared, called the medieval Dark Ages. It was a period of intellectual darkness and brutality, lasting from around the 5th or 6th century AD and ending with the rise of the Italian Renaissance in the 14th century. As an investigation into the crisis of our time will show, today we too see these morbid symptoms appear in three major areas of our society. First, at the individual level, and how thousands upon thousands of men and women have become humanly dislocated. They are anxious, restless, fearful, uncertain, and unsettled as never before in the world's history. The second set of morbid symptoms to appear is in family life. The breakdown of family, marriage, family values, the rise of domestic violence, separation, and divorce, and the toll this takes on the children, and then outward from there to the destruction at the social level of our society. The third area in which we see these morbid symptoms appear is in leadership, particularly in global leadership and the divorce of power and politics, and how this divorce is threatening our democratic representative governance as power flows from the old system to the new liquid economy in the new spaces of the flow called the Internet, free from all territorial regulation. The impotence of government goes hand in hand with the growing cynicism and distrust of citizens. We yell and scream and protest constantly, wanting our leaders to do more, and they are unable to do that because of this shift of power. And so the current crisis of modernity is at once a crisis of agency of government at every level, but even more important, it is a crisis of representative democracy and a crisis of the sovereignty of the state, because power has shifted to what some call the liquid modernity of the digital age and the global networks of financial market sectors. Now, this is just a quick summary of the diagnosis of the symptoms of our time. Let's explore these a bit deeper and see what the Urantia papers have to say on these subjects. So just to get us started, let's start at the social and the individual level. In this interregnum, we have entered a state of anomie, or the anomic state. Anomie, as a social condition, is one in which there is a lack of cohesion and order, especially in relation to social norms and values. This concept was developed by Emil Durkheim as part of his explanation of patterns of depression and suicide in 19th century Europe. Durkheim discovered that the rules of how individuals interact with one another were disintegrating at this time of the birth of the modern society and the modern state. and therefore people were unable to determine how to act with one another in this new environment. As a consequence, Durkheim declared that a state of anomie existed, where the expectations of behavior are unclear, because the old system of values and mores had broken down. This became known as normlessness, and today we use the term the new normal. Same thing. Durkheim claimed that this normlessness was the main cause of fear, anxiety, deviant behaviors, depression, and suicide. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Again, the Urantia Book in paper 99, section 4, tells us this. During the psychologically unsettled times of the 20th and 21st century, amid the economic upheavals, the moral crosscurrents, and the sociological riptides of the cyclonic transitions of a scientific era, thousands upon thousands of men and women have become humanly dislocated. They are anxious, restless, fearful, uncertain, and unsettled. As never before in the world's history, they need consolation and stabilization. In the face of unprecedented scientific achievement and mechanical development, there is spiritual stagnation and philosophic chaos. Doesn't that bear repeating? But isn't there also in there a clue? The idea of anomie means a lack of normal ethical and social standards. When a social system is in a state of anomie or anomic, common values and common meanings are no longer understood or accepted, and new values and meanings have not yet developed. We see this in what is often referred to as the culture wars. We see this in the discussions of what constitutes bullying or not in the workplace or in the school, and what constitutes politically correct language or not. Such a society produces in many of its members psychological states characterized by a sense of futility, a lack of purpose, even depression, anxiety, emotional emptiness, and despair. For so many, striving is considered useless because there is no accepted definition of what is desirable. Don't we all know someone who fits this description? Maybe even sitting in our own seat. Anomie has been widely used to describe the consequences of rapid social change and the emergence of this new intersection of consciousness, culture, and social structure. Most often, anomie refers to a social context in which there is a lack of consensus between generations or even citizens in the same community regarding the normative means of pursuing cultural and value goals. But that is changing, and that is changing rapidly. The understanding and the definition between goals, means, and ends. Urantia paper in paper 16, section 7 says, moral acts are those human performances which are characterized by the highest intelligence, directed by selective discrimination in the choice of superior ends, as well as the selection of moral means to attain these ends. Such conduct is called virtuous, or virtue. An example is a society in which success goals, often defined primarily in monetary terms, are emphasized for everyone in the culture. And people are criticized as being quitters if they scale back these goals to go and do something different. On the other hand, the culture is at best ambivalent in its norms about the appropriate means of being successful. It's all changing. Now, certainly hard work and ambition in school and then in the economic marketplace are the culturally approved means of success, easily understood. But there's also been an element of admiration for the robber baron, the rogue that breaks the rules about appropriate means, but achieves successful goals or success by some deviant means. America in particular have always loved their outlaws. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, and now all these new ones coming online. In other words, the accumulation of wealth, as the definition of success, by however means, has become rated a lot more highly than has virtue in a secular materialist society. Paper 16, Section 7 again tells us, intelligence alone cannot explain the moral nature. Well, that's for sure. We all know smart guys who are not good guys. Morality, which is virtue, is indigenous to human personality. It's built in. Moral intuition, which is the realization of duty, is a component of the human mind endowment and is associated with other inaliables of human nature: scientific curiosity and spiritual insight. Two inaliables. Man's mentality far transcends that of his animal cousins, but it is moral and spiritual natures that especially distinguish him from the animal world. Thus, our very high rates of deviance and crime compared with other societies can be understood first as a result of our emphasizing materialistic success goals more than we emphasize values and approved means of achieving those goals. And second, are emphasizing the idea that the same kind of success means the same thing for everyone in society, even while the intolerance that's circling around race, ethnic, and class stratification of the society limits the opportunities for success by some of those in these less privileged groups. Paper 71 of the Urantia Book says, but no state can attain ideal levels of functioning until every form of intolerance is mastered. Not eliminated, mastered. It is everlastingly inimical to human progress. There is a situation in which there is an apparent lack of fit between the culture's norms about what constitutes success in one's life and one's goals, and the culture's norms about the appropriate ways to achieve those goals, the means. The papers also tell us in 71, no society has progressed very far when it permits idleness or tolerates poverty. The next paragraph says, a moral society should aim to preserve the self-respect of its citizenry and afford every normal individual adequate opportunity for self-realization. Such a plan of social achievement would yield a cultural society of the highest order. Isn't that what we want? Social evolution should be encouraged by governmental supervision, which exercises a minimum of regulative control. That state is best which coordinates most while governing least. Anomie, as a social disorder, is social instability resulting from a breakdown of standards and values, and we see it everywhere. Anomie, as an individual disorder, is used to refer to the psychological state of individuals who experience a personal state of isolation and anxiety due to their perceived loss of trust in others and in government, and in addition, a pronounced lack of purpose. All each of us need to do is to ask ourselves, what is my purpose? A person suffering anomie has lost all personal sense of purpose and social obligation as a citizen, as a result of losing trust in others as supportive or concerned about their welfare. At one end of the spectrum, such a state of mind renders the individual incapable of forming close bonds with others and sharing goals and acceptable means of attaining them. Thus, their isolation increases. We see this today in our society as something they call the angry young man syndrome. Such individuals suffer anxiety, feelings of futility and purposelessness, often becoming amoral, often dangerous, and disconnected from the social norms of others around them. Paper 100, Section 5 tells us the world is filled with lost souls. Not lost in a theologic sense, but lost in the directional meaning, wandering about in the confusions among the isms and cults of a frustrated philosophic era. Too few have learned how to install a philosophy of living in the place of religious or political authority and ideologies that determine their worldview, whether it be religious, secular, liberal, conservative, left, right, male, female, reality, or alternative reality. The old ideologies have lost their credibility, and we have not replaced them with a new worldview that can give us direction and meaning, a philosophy of living, a new vision of the future. As all leaders have known throughout all of history, the old saying, without vision, the people perish. We will be discussing at length in our next few sections and chapters all of this. Chapter 2, Civilization in Crisis. So please, click the subscribe button on this channel up above, and we'll send you a notification when the next one is up. Follow us on Facebook at this address, and follow us on our webpage, the Urantia Book for Dummies.org, where you can view the previous chapters and the previous videos of this series, the Urantia Book for Dummies, Chapter 2, Civilization in Crisis. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Dirty noise, dirty places coming through. Extreme worlds alone. Did you ever like it then? I would stand in line for this. There's always room in life for this.